Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I know it's a little bit early. I hope we've all enjoyed the past 2 days and had plenty of meetings. So thank you for joining us on our final day. Before we kick off, I'd just like to thank our sponsors again. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. We've also got a little antitrust notice, competition law, you know. So particularly our diamond sponsors, NTT and China Unicom, our platinum sponsor, China Telecom, and our gold sponsors, China Mobile International and Console Connect PCCW Global. Our silver sponsors, and finally, thanks to all our bronze sponsors too. So the first conversation of today is around softwarisation. We've got a pretty good lineup for you. I'll invite the panelists to join the stage now, and your moderator, Jan from Delta Partners. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. How's it going? And good to see everybody who managed to come here in such an early hour of the morning. Hopefully you're all caffeinated enough to proceed through this panel with us. So my name is Janne Pajunimi. I'm from Delta Partners. We're a global telco, media, and technology sector-focused strategy consultancy and investment advisory. It's my great pleasure to be facilitating this panel discussion in the morning. And we have a super interesting topic. And we have 3 impressive panelists joining us, industry senior leaders, and hopefully that will give you a good head start to the morning and keep you energized for the rest of the day. Today's topic is something that is very high on our global carrier clients' strategic agendas. And it's also one of the key focus areas where we are helping our clients globally to strategize and drive execution. Softwarisation. Softwarisation might not be the first word that comes to the mind of people outside of our industry, right? In any case, softwarisation, the shift is happening, it's taking place in the industry as carriers are redefining more and more their propositions to better suit the needs of, changing needs of the customers and enterprises. And there's a lot of technology buzzwords and development underpinning softwarisation, virtualization, cloudification, IoT, edge computing, open APIs. So in order to explore the topic today, I'd like to organize the flow into 5 specific themes. First theme covers our panelists' views to softwarisation and where your respective organizations are in the journey. 2, we also want to talk about the opportunity in softwarisation. Number 3, we won't get out of this panel without talking about the key trends. 4th theme, we're going to try to cover how to win, how carriers can win. And the 5th theme is then what is the role of collaboration between carriers. There's a lot of topics to cover. We'll pivot as seems fit. Also, one thing I'd like to ask, if you have any questions during our panel, please raise your hand, you'll get a mic, and you have the opportunity to raise your questions to the panelists. So don't be afraid, let's keep this interactive. But before we dig deeper into the topic itself, I'd like the panelists to introduce themselves and their organization. And let's start with Ricky, you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Ricky Chow, so I am the Chief Strategy Officer for CBC Tech. So we are a SD-WAN and SASE providers, and we operate a nationwide fabric in China and about 25 market internationally. My role is really responsible for the corporate developments and transformation. I also have responsibility for the business developments and customer experience. So I'm very excited to be on this panel and talking with my fellow panelists.
Okay, let's go to Paul.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Gamp, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Console Connect, which was acquired by PCCW Global just over 5 years ago. My remit inside the organization is obviously the development of our platform, and an interesting topic that we'll be discussing today is it's a combination of both our software skills and our network skills. So I'm also in charge of our IP network, and that I think is a really interesting topic that we'll get to discuss today about how that joining software with network and an organizational design was part of our success. And really looking forward to today's conversation.
Michael.
Thanks very much. So I'm Michael Wheeler. I head up our global internet backbone business for NTT. From an overall perspective, software and automation in and of itself is a key part of how we run and operate our business. So this is a great topic as well. Certainly something that I think is not only interesting for our business, but for a whole bunch of businesses that are similar to ours out there, and PCCW Global being one of those examples for sure. So yeah, excited about the conversation.
Thanks, everybody. So let's go to our first theme. As I mentioned, we're going to start with the perspectives on softwarization. So what does softwarization mean to your organization? And how would you describe the stage of softwarization where you are currently? And shall we start with Paul?
So one of the attributes of softwarization that came about through the acquisition of Console Connect by PCCW Global is that we had an existing platform that was already enabling self-service for automated connectivity. And the role that we took was to integrate that platform into the network. So from that perspective, it meant that we began the softwarization of Global from the outside in. We already knew what the user experience needed to look like. We knew how the enterprise wanted to be able to provision services from one data center to another data center or a data center to a cloud. And I think by contrast, if we were to be doing that from the inside out, you get stuck in trying to automate your existing processes, and it doesn't have that transformative effect that explains, actually, we need to think about this completely differently. Softwarization isn't me as a network engineer building software to do what I do. Softwarization is letting the enterprise do what they want to do in a self-service manner, and then dramatically impacting everything you do inside your organization to accommodate the way the user wants to use your network, not the way that you use your network on behalf of the customer. And that, I think, was only capable because we have a great CEO, Mark Holtfinger, who acknowledged that software needed to be central to the DNA of the organization and afforded us the opportunity to dictate the way the BSS and OSS had to respond to the way our customers wanted to use our systems. So humbly, I think we've achieved a lot of what the enterprise need to do. But right now, there's probably a customer provisioning a service globally on our network because we've made it available for them to do so.
And Paul, the context in the case of Console Connect is very interesting. You have PCCW and acquisition, bringing that sort of a small tech company into a larger telco. What were the challenges, or what challenges do you see currently in the softwarization journey that you're on?
The first and biggest challenge was whether to stop wearing my Silicon Valley t-shirts and start wearing a suit. On the day that we were acquired, we had a big launch event, and I was brought up on stage by Mark and asked to put a tie on. I'd been a Silicon Valley startup for 4 years, and t-shirts was all I do, and he wanted to see if I could actually put on a tie. And the minute after I put a tie on, he takes his suit off, takes his shirt off, and he's got a Console Connect t-shirt. And where we've ended up today is that we all wear the same socks. And so I think that's part of it. You know, the DNA is we've got this incredibly respected, trusted infrastructure as operators around the world, and we know it's taken decades of really disciplined engineering to get there, but it's not the way the enterprise consume it. They're not going to fax in an order anymore. They need connectivity to Amazon in Singapore from Hong Kong now, and they want to click a button to do it. And that's all software.
Thanks. Well, that's a good perspective. And maybe Michael, your reflections, a bit different context for NTT.
Yes, I think there are obviously more than one use case for softwarization or more than one example of that. For me, at least, the things I'll reference in this discussion will be much more about our global internet network, not the holistic part of NTT. That's too big to cover in any one conversation for sure. But for us, it was really, when we built the first generation, shall we say, of our software-defined networking controller, it was over 20 years ago, and it was essentially to try to address the scale of the network as it was growing, but also to try to manage cost and operate the business in an efficient and more predictable fashion. And so for us, that's where our kind of journey started, was that initial foray into automation and using a programmatic methodology to configure and manage the network. And allow, to some extent, customers to use the network how they want to do it, for sure. But really, that's somewhat inherent, in my mind, to BGP and communities and some of those tools that exist kind of for anybody who's using an internet connection and has, multiple networks they're connected to, that kind of thing. They're not doing static routing, in essence. And so we certainly agree wholly with the idea that customers should use the network to the extent they want to use it and how they want to use it, especially across a global sphere. So that's certainly common. I think the one difference in our use case is that outside of routing traffic to wherever and however they would choose to as a customer, the reality is that when customers are adding capacity, that's not a mouse click, right? There's actually physical ports and connections that have to occur at a physical layer to enable them to add capacity. You can't. I'm not aware of a way to put 30 gigs of traffic over a single 10 gig connection, right? So to do that, they ultimately have to add physical capacity. That takes actual physical work to be done, whether it's on a router or in a meet-me room or wherever it might be. So that's where our probably use case differs in some regard, is that the ability to route and the software that either the customer is using to do that on their side and/or how it communicates with our implementation of the network is part of that collaboration you kind of alluded to. But the reality is that our customers ultimately are needing to add physical network capacity as well. And that's not just something they can do through a piece of software as a standalone item, right? It can start there, it can certainly be a part of it. And that's how our use case around automation is really kind of how we leverage that.
Thanks, Michael. And Ricky, softwarization.
Yeah, so perhaps I share a story back in 2017, and we've seen the emergence of SD-WAN starting to disrupt the enterprise WAN, from at that time it's MPLS VPN. So we actually make a strategic decision to invent or create our own SD-WAN fabric. So it took us almost like 2 years to put together a R&D team in China. And start to put the platform together, and we commercialized that in 2020. And we look at this as a very strategic move for us to really move. Used to be a network provider, but now we have our own SD-WAN fabric, and that give the benefit to customize different solution for our customer. Also give us the capability to integrate multi-SD-WAN and integrate SASE to have a better integrated solution for enterprise customers. So this is, I think this is still a journey. I think when you look at the customer demand and what they want from us, I think there's still a long way to go. And I think this is interesting that when we look at our 3-year roadmap and the amount of talent that we require to hire in order to enable those capability in our fabric. So this is our journey in softwarization.
Got it. And if I think about softwarization, does it mean we're actually doing a transition from the typical being a typical carrier to being a technology company. How would you describe the shift or change?
From my perspective, I don't see it's a shift. We still operate the network layer. We still operate our layer 2 and layer 3 level and the IP level. But I think the shift is to really converge the network platform and also having our own technology layer on top of that, right? So we can offer software-defined level. We can integrate SASE. We can offer different type of solution for customers. I think this is very important. I think that's a product side, quite frankly. The other piece that we are also looking at that is, yeah, great, you have those new product, but how do we offer digital experience to a customer, right? So I think this is, even from my perspective, is even more important, right? You can have the best product, but if you don't deliver the best customer experience, you're not going to maintain your business.
So change more towards customer centricity. Paul, please offer your perspective on the same, the transition and.
Yeah, I think I alluded to earlier, the fact that we'd already had a platform, we'd already done all the usability studies to understand how enterprises needed to consume network services, meant that we had that understanding as a starting point. And so, I'm sure all of us would in the room are going to say, yeah, we're tech companies. Yeah, absolutely, we're tech. I've got the cool socks to prove it. The reason we say that, though, is because we're using technology to enable access to something of value. We talk about Amazon or Google or Azure. We think, oh, yeah, they're tech companies for sure. But really, they're just technology providers to compute and storage. And so why are we not tech providers to network and connectivity? The paradigm's exactly the same. The fact is that networks are arguably somewhat more difficult to automate, and that comes down to the culture of networking, right? If you're a network engineer, as Michael and I would know, the last thing you want is change. Change is your enemy. Change is, we're all heading into Windows here where we don't want anybody to touch our network. We want to be able to have a decent break. And so anybody touching the network, anybody introducing change represents risk. And we all perceive that. You open up your phone, you didn't have network connectivity, you'd be angry.
How do you then keep up with the change that is demanded by the customers and any specific ways of working that you would contrast to the typical telco?
But if you open up your phone and look at a new app and it's, oh, wow, I've got some change. There's been a version upgrade, and software is considered that change is my friend. Every time I do change, I get new value. And so the dichotomy is the fact that network engineers hate change and software engineers love change. So how do you bridge the gap between the two? And for us, that's been organizational design and a mutual respect and admiration. The value's in the network. That's what the customer needs. But the route to market is through the software. And and that respect for both is what afforded us the opportunity to agile, embrace strategies to accelerate delivery to the customer.
And Paul, would you want to elaborate on the type of organization change you were referring to?
Yeah, so the first and most critical thing that we did was acknowledge that the culture needed to change first. It's not the tech stack, it's not whether you're doing Python to orchestrate your network or whether you're using React.js for your front end. You can't get to these decisions unless there's a common culture and behavior in terms of how work is prioritized and how you deliver value to the users. So it really began with us having a broad-based understanding of what an agile way of working was, what that means in terms of values for the individual, and then being able to say, okay, we're going to work this way, we will use this language, we will do this type of structure, this is the priority from the user, this is how we're going to implement it. And then the conversations about, okay, technically what does that mean occurred?
Thanks. And Michael, thoughts?
So I would just add to that and share a little bit of our experience. So as I mentioned, we started doing our own SDN in the late 90s, actually, when Verio was first coming in before we were acquired by NTT. And so it was part of our DNA. I think it's the culture part of it's a very important point that you make. And so it existed, but I will say over time, it was not it became a bit fragmented even in our own organization. And so about 5-6 years ago, we ultimately had to restructure how we had all of our software development occurring and put it into a single group, even though they were working on different parts of the software that we were developing, things that we were doing in-house, as well as how we engaged with outside vendors for software services, because we essentially have a combination of both those things. And I think that was another example of maybe the organizational kind of approach that you're talking about. At least it was for us. So I think that's a very important thing. And to go back to your question about telcos and technology, I do think there's an interesting example of this, an analog. If you go back in time about 10 years ago, basically every telco was trying to launch a cloud service and build their own cloud service. And generally speaking, as an industry, telco organizations are not great software development organizations, certainly not 10 years ago. And so while there was, I think, an interest in it because cloud was so hot, it was so sexy, it was so, the market loved it, everybody wanted to talk about it. The reality is no one's very good at it except for people that are actually software companies at their core. And those are the hyperscalers you've already talked about, right? And those people are really the ones who really are now still dominating that space. Even if you include Oracle, for example, in that list, really they're a software company at their genesis. And I think that is something that has changed. But I think through that transition, while I can't name a cloud that's operated by a telco carrier at this point in time that has any level of success, I think there was a big learning for the industry that took place in that process, and a recognition that software is important, that we have to look at it differently than maybe we had previously as an industry, and within each company example, what does that mean for those companies? So I think as an industry, the telco, we have shifted in that sense, but it was a bit painful and a bit of a difficult process at times for the industry, even if there were parts of our businesses respectively that were already kind of committed to software. The industry as a whole wasn't, I would say, 10 years ago. I think that is something that has definitely changed. And everybody's still at different stages in that progression. Because, software, especially anything to do with running your own development, is not an event. It's a journey. It's something that is an iterative journey that continues. And once you're committed to it, you have to continue to invest in it. Writing software is not easy, and writing good software is even harder than that. And so you have to continue to be committed to it. That's a long-term journey. It's not a, hey, we did it, we checked the box, now we move on to the next thing. It's a progression that's a constant, perpetual thing.
Thanks, Michael. Follow-up, talent. I guess talent plays a key role in becoming a software-oriented company. How are you solving for that part of the equation, attracting the top talent and maybe a bit different type of talent?
Is
it getting easier now? There seems to be announced layoffs in tech players. Your thoughts?
Well, and I'm sure Paul has a perspective on this as well, but finding talent, especially talent that has the right context, because it's not just about writing code, it's about understanding what the purpose of that is and how customers will want to use that and use that capability. So yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, but again, that's not going to, regardless of what happens in the Bay Area with how many ever layoffs occur and stuff, there's still going to be a demand for talented software developers and talented software developers in particular languages, as well as with particular kind of context and background. That's where it gets incredibly challenging. So I would say for us, at least fortunately, we've really seen some of our talent kind of grow internally, and people that have been a part of the organization in one area have an interest in it and kind of grown into it. And then that context is built in. So that kind of farming system, if you will, has been very helpful for us. But our scale is relatively small compared to, let's say, other organizations that have, maybe thousands of developers or something. So it's not the same. You can't do that at that scale, right? But yeah, talent's a huge thing. And then honestly, actually, not just the writing of the code, but the people that are managing and leading those teams, especially across the other parts of the organization that depend upon the software, that use it every day, that really are that user base internally at least. You have to have the right attitude and the right kind of culture in that regard as well, kind of as Paul mentioned. But yeah, it's not easy. It's the talent part of it, the people part of it. Ricky and I have talked about this before in other forums in the past about the talent challenge inside of the industry, and it's not easy. But yeah, I think it's nice to have some interest in an industry where there's a bit more stability than the ups and downs that can occur sometimes in the valley.
Absolutely. Ricky?
I think it's, when we look at talent, it's not about just the software developers and the tech people. I think, we got to really transform the company culture as well, from my perspective, because quite frankly, we started as a network service provider, right? So we've been in the business for a long time, and a few years ago, we are kind of moving to tech, we converge tech. So we still have a majority of employees still coming from the old telco background. So one thing that we done is, one, we do rebranding, but more than that is really, just coach them. How do we solve problem, right? How do we leverage technology? How do we change the process? So that's a big piece of what we're doing, in addition to all the digital transformation that we are doing today. And the other piece is that when we look at your hiring plan, it's very, very different. All day we hire people coming from industry. Yeah, we like to hire people with 10, 15, 20 experience in the telecom industry, no matter you're doing sales or in service delivery or customer support. Now it's very different. We actually started hiring people not necessarily coming from a telco background, right? We like people, really hire people coming from a tech background. We've never done customer support before, but I think the tech knowledge is really, very important as we grow. So I think that really changed the profile of the people that we are hiring, and we also try to change that the people that are working with us and kind of moving the telco mindset, if you will, to a more tech mindset.
And Paul, maybe if you can elaborate, are there specific expertise that is required to fuel softwarization?
Yeah, so the three things that we think about with talent is mastery, progression, and purpose. And how do we create an environment where a young graduate or a network engineer with some seniority is going to want to be excited about an opportunity to work with us? And let's face it, in an increasingly complex political environment, the global carrier community couldn't be more purposeful charter to be a part of. Every time you're on a Zoom call, you're avoiding the carbon footprint of a flight. Every time we're connecting economies around the world, we're dissipating tension that may occur across the planet. These are an incredibly purposeful thing to be a part of. And when you have that conversation with somebody who's interested in joining our sector, it's motivating. I'm excited to be here because I have that opportunity to contribute to the planet in that way. And the fact that we've been operating this code base for almost 9 years now means that we've got enough of a structure in terms of southbound interfaces into the network, front-end applications, workflow engines, that you can get a lot of skill quite quickly in our stack. And so the mastery element's there because you're working with an engineer who's been either in this network or in this code base for almost a decade. And you can leave us as a network engineer or a software engineer with a really high level of competency, either in workflow, front-end, et cetera. So the mastery is there as well. You've got your purpose, and you've got the progression. So I certainly haven't felt since Console Connect or the acquisition of PCCW Global that we've had a talent problem. We've had difficulty communicating the value proposition to potential employees at times. But once you clarify that there's mastery, purpose, and proficiency and progression in the company, then talent follows you. They find you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. Let's move on to our second theme, which is what is the opportunity for carriers? So is it in the radical automation enabled by software-defined networks? Is it in innovation and growth, reinventing the carrier proposition, or combination? So maybe
I've got a throwaway line I've got to give Michael. Friends don't let friends build clouds. They're incredibly hard, right? So why would you try? So I think the opportunity and we're going to get to it in your next topic, it's about collaboration, right? Nobody owns a local loop to every point on the planet. So as an industry, we have to collaborate. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, understand. Maybe, Michael, how do you see the value in softwarization? Cost, growth? both or something totally different?
I think it's kind of all of those things and maybe even some more, to be honest. I mean, from my perspective, it's certainly a lifeblood for not just our industry, but really for business in general. So the word we haven't used yet, which is kind of surprising, is digitization, right? I mean, this whole digitization transformation that is being talked about really amongst almost any industry, even industries like farming or manufacturing, which was not originally kind of thought of in those terms. But I think that software enables those kinds of things to happen. So if you're trying to monitor devices over the network that are remote in some way, and we also haven't used the word IoT yet, which is, I'll throw that in there for the mix of things. So, that's all part of what, softwarization is what allows those things to happen and what allows those applications for whatever use case to be utilized. So to me, it's the crux of kind of all the different things that I think our businesses try to do and as an industry we try to do, as well as a series of other industries, the clouds, the different application developers, all of those pieces. So without software, those things just wouldn't be viable. They wouldn't exist in almost any way.
Ricky?
I see two pieces. One is revenue or growth, because when you look at, from an enterprise perspective, enterprise is moving to software-defined. Why? Because enterprise workload will be moving to cloud, the adoption of software service. So the private networking is not probably the ideal, architecture for the enterprise, right? So, they are moving to hybrid networking, they're moving to software-defined, WAN. So that's a growth opportunity from us, having that, fabric, and still a lot of work to do. The other piece is cost, right? So today, I think you should look at traditional telco process. We keep doing the same thing we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years. So I think the opportunity for us to look at how could we do it differently. But I like to look at that from a process perspective first, before we get into technology. And I think this is really, how do we leverage softwarization or technology to make us more efficient and to scale better, right? So we don't need to keep hiring more people as a business grows, but how can we leverage the same amount of employee and do more together?
How do you see the automation potential in your case?
So in my case, I see some, but I can tell you very honestly that there's a challenge to do that, because the environment that we are in, right, we're not really doing everything on that. So you look at enterprise brand with 20, 30, 100 locations around the world, probably 95% of the location we are off that, which means that we have to work with a third-party provider. So we don't have the luxury that having that API with everybody's database and give us all the automation that you can order that online. We are not at this stage yet. I like to do that. So I think going back to that ecosystem and collaboration among carrier, I think this is very important.
And Paul,
let me just add one thing. I think part of what Ricky touched on that is really important. I think the customer experience component of this is very critical, I think, and I think that's what you're speaking to a little bit. And another example that we have is we built basically a migration tool that allows us to utilize automation to minimize the impact for a planned maintenance. If you're taking down a router to do something to it and you have hundreds of customers on that device, shrinking the period of time it takes to actually make that migration happen is dramatically beneficial to customers. And automation is the only way you can do that. It doesn't matter how many engineers you throw at trying to solve that little problem, automation allows you to do that. And it also allows you to do it in a way that provides for protection of any kind of misconfiguration, all those kinds of things. You can do all that stuff in advance and just load it very, very quickly. That's a huge customer experience benefit in my mind, kind of similar to what you're kind of referring to.
Yeah, and I feel really confident that software is going to afford this industry the phenomenal growth that's happening, right? I'm sure everybody in the room would agree there's a massive amount of growth in the distribution of data. And predominantly what we do is connect source to destination. What's happening is the source of data is changing. It's not the voice calls anymore. It's some SIM card probably in the camera. It's some sensor in the room producing telemetry on humidity and thermal properties of the environment and distributing that to some cloud, right? So the sources are increasing, they're multiplying, they're now fully automated, they're embedded systems, and the destinations are the cloud. And to get to those, you need software. You need IoT gateways, you need cloud on-ramps. And so to be able to continue to grow into that value proposition of connecting source to destination, we need to become software companies, because that's how we get the on-ramps and the off-ramps out of our network. So I'm excited. I think there's a huge growth, but it'll only be those carriers that embrace the fact that that where the data's going is not where it used to go.
Uncertainty. Any question from the audience on opportunities? Any specific? Yeah. Okay. Coming.
Richard Ma from National University of Singapore. So it was mentioned that cooperations among the telcos will be important, right? I'm just wondering, is there any existing efforts or mechanisms that is related to that? And a related question is, I think it is clear that SDN plays a role from the business side, but from a technological point of view, what are the common key technologies that is going to be the standard? I guess now everybody is doing their own SDN using very different approaches. Maybe in principle there's some common principles, but the way different companies doing the thing will be very different. It's not like TCP/IP. It's the same thing everybody is using. It's not like the BGP everybody is using, right? So that's it. Thanks.
So on the second question, I would say I think the industry shift, different than what I talked about before around the cloud stuff, but that took place around is NetConf-Yang. I think those dynamics and that capability it really has changed and created a much more, you have different models that are being used now for software-defined network management. They're much more common in the industry. Again, we kind of built ours. Nothing existed, so we built it from scratch. And it was, again, a kind of necessity is the mother invention type of situation. If that was, 15 years later, we probably would have used directly more. And we do some NetCom stuff now in our system, but it's not the basis of our platform. So I think that change, though, I think is something that's much more prevalent in the industry. I think that, if you're looking at, like, for example, Cisco XR, that's built into how they've defined that software platform to run the Cisco platform that is out there today most prevalently. They at times have had many different operating systems, but XR has become kind of the dominant one at this point for Cisco. So those do exist to some degree. Is it the same type of standard of BGP or TCP/IP? No, I don't think it's that. But there are definitely better tools and better open source type models to those things now than have ever existed in the past. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely improved. You probably have a perspective.
I'd agree, Michael. And I wouldn't dismiss, if you're an educator in a university, the criticality of BGP is still really important. Michael operates one of the best. Yeah.
I'm not saying we need to replace. I'm saying in the SDN domain,
right.
In the common technology that will be used by everyone.
Yeah, I would argue that it is the MEF Lifecycle Orchestration Sonata API. So we have a standards body, there's hundreds of carriers that contribute to it, and we're presenting to industry, particularly enterprises and others, a northbound API that allows you to orchestrate the full life cycle of a connectivity service. We're definitely collapsing down onto Ethernet, we're collapsing down onto BGP as the implementers of that underlying infrastructure, but what we're presenting back to the rest of the industry is this MEF Sonata API.
Maybe I comment on the first question. I think the cooperation among carriers has been in place for many, many years, right? Because quite frankly, none of carrier can cover the whole world, right? So we have to work with multiple carriers from local loop or SS, whatever that may be. I think the issue is how do we do that digitally, right? Because we have a process in place that for the most part is manually, right? So I'd like to see that. I think MEF is doing something for API that the carrier can work together, not to digitally through the API. So I can get a price instantly from carrier A, and I can link that with my FOS system, so we can get everything very seamless when we engage our customer.
Okay, good question. Yeah. more questions, just raise your hand and you'll get the mic.
I think if Capacity gave out cash prizes for questions from the audience, we'd get more questions. It's just an idea. I'll just throw it out there.
Maybe I'll continue, Ricky, with yourself. You mentioned earlier that there's still value to be realized. From your perspective, you're not yet realizing the full value of softwarization. So what needs to be done?
Well, we have, I would say, a limited resources in R&D. There's a lot we don't want to invest, but quite frankly, it's not easy to hire good people, right? So I think that's one, right? So I think, and then this is really probably a good story to learn from Paul, is how you groom those from fresh grad and bring that to your team. This is something that we are doing. And the other piece is, today, our developer, they are in tier 1 city. Somehow it's expensive and the talent pool is quite limited. So we're kind of looking at, so should we do in other city, right? So that we can have better talent pool and bring them to the team. So that's one piece. And then the other issue that is interesting, that I would say most developers that we hire, they don't come from a telco background. They don't really understand what problem we're solving, right? So they're very, very good in coding, they're very good in developing. But so what we try to do is, how do we work together between the development team, the product team, and then my team to really align, and we work on the same roadmap. And I'll share a story with you. When we launched our portal, the first version, it's so complicated. I mean, if you're not a networking engineer, you don't know how to navigate that, right? So we got a very good feedback from some customers like it because they're engineer. They say, yeah, I like those functions. But if you talk to a non-networking, a customer or IT professional, they was, well, this is very complicated. So I think that feedback really, give us to offer a kind of 2 version in our portal. So we have a professional version, which is really for the networking engineer. They want to navigate all the SD-WAN stuff. And then we have a general portal, right? So for laymen, they can navigate the portal.
So that's well aligned with the customer centricity you mentioned earlier. Michael, Paul, anything you want to add on the opportunities?
I think I feel like we've touched on the kind of the broad scope of opportunities. I think there are, the more, I guess, day-to-day opportunities that exist in our different organizations. I mean, Ricky's example of the portal and some of those, but I think that we all have those types of things that we're kind of addressing in-house, if you will, and addressing, within our own organizations. And hopefully, that ties back to what customer kind of needs, expectations, desires are, and that drives a lot of that, outcome. But that's, I would say, the opportunities are fairly large in scale, and certainly, I won't say unlimited, but there's not a lot of limits in my mind.
May I jump on one thing? I think this
Absolutely.
is something very interesting that, when you look at customer requirement, back in the telco, we talk about SLA. We talk about, what's your latency, what's your jitter, what's your packet loss. But when we, think as a tech company, we don't talk about this because those are not really meaningful to application, right? So we start looking at what's the application performance, not only specific application, but how do we enable differentiated experience for different applications for our customer.
Got it. Paul, anything before we move to the third?
Yeah,
team?
so I think there's 3 things there. Firstly, IoT, the integration of mobility as a way to get to that on-ramp, how many mobile devices are in the room, how many pieces of sensors are contributing data. What can we do to get that data from increasing the total addressable market of our on-ramps into our networks through using mobile networks? And I think that's a really key part to our growth. The second is this MEF Sonata API and the fact that we can begin to standardize their complex interconnections between our networks and move beyond just sharing BGP communities to pass on some attribute of connectivity, but actually orchestrate a connection between networks so that we can cover the globe. And then what can we do as an industry to impact the hyperscalers to reduce the burden we bear with all their proprietary independent APIs for on-ramp interfaces, which Michael's probably dealing with, Ricky's dealing with, I'm dealing with. We have to carry the cost of the fact that the hyperscalers won't collaborate, where we as an industry collaborate. So I think they're the three things I'd focus on. Mobility is really core to how we can address the demand, and acting as a community of like-minded industry partners to influence the hyperscalers, saying, look, you need to standardize so that we can get the destinations automated.
And Michael, maybe we start with you. What are the specific trends you are following when it comes to softwarization or adjacent areas, and maybe something that you're already starting to address?
It's a big question, actually. I think that for us, our kind of focus really ties to how we're managing the network and the interaction the customers have with the network. So that's kind of our main orientation. But one of the trends that is clearly, this gets a little bit granular technically, but is the move from how networks are being managed to utilizing telemetry. And Paul kind of touched on the volume of data that exists now. And telemetry-based network management is definitely a trend that's occurring. Again, it's kind of in the very hardcore network engineering, IP dev environments, but probably not something you're going to see on Facebook tomorrow or anything. But that's actually a pretty major trend. And what it allows us to do from managing the network and being able to utilize the resources of the network in a very different way than currently and how we've done it for really a couple decades. So that's a trend that we're spending quite a bit of time looking at and studying and figuring out what. You also have to be very thoughtful in regard to what's kind of real and what's a bit vapor as you're going to some of these next trajectories. And telemetry, I think, is one of those as well. There are, I guess the best way to say it, there are claims about how it can improve the performance of devices on the network, but until you actually prove those out, either in a pseudo-production environment or at least in a lab ourselves, we never really trust, we have a healthy skepticism, I should say, about what vendors or kind of protagonists of those different technologies are. So telemetry is one of those, but it's certainly one of the ones that we think has a lot of benefits potentially, but they're not realized yet, at least not from our point of view.
Thanks. Ricky?
Probably three things. I think 4G, mobility, 4G and 5G become used to be leveraged for backup, but we see this become a alternate asset. And in some cases, actually, they use 5G as the main asset, especially like for the retail environment. That's one. The second piece is SASE, right? When you look at our security, cloud-based security, when you look at the adoption of SD-WAN and using more and more internet as the assets, I think security has become a very big concern. So what we're actually doing is how do we integrate SASE with our current SD-WAN to offer that secure access to our customer. And the last piece is more internal is how do we leverage AI machine learning, especially in operation, in fault management. So those are three things that we're looking at today.
Paul, anything to add on top of that?
And trying to go for the buzzword bingo championship here.
Nobody mentioned artificial intelligence and...
No, if you were to look at what I've tracked list, I'm really interested in Rust. I think there's a really interesting transformation into formal languages as that transformation of Linux kernel, potentially from C to Rust. eBPF in the Linux kernel, the fact that we can start to do offloading into DPUs for processing at the edge. We talk about SASE, we talk about SD-WAN, we talk about all of these technologies, but how are we going to actually implement that on a device and potentially on a white box to dramatically lower that cost of ownership and get away from proprietary vendors? So DPUs, eBPF, Rust, these are the sort of things that I'm really excited about, getting the actual NFV instantiated in open source at the edge of our networks.
Okay. Let's move on to the fourth theme, which is how do we win? Broad, but for example, what is the winning formula for carriers to start leveraging or proceeding in their journey, softwarization journey? And how do you expect softwarization to change the competitive landscape? So we've talked about hyperscalers. There are as-a-service players, SIs, and carriers. So how do we win? Maybe we can start with Michael.
I think winning is a relative thing in certain cases, right? So I guess whoever has the highest market cap at whatever point in time could be the winner, right? I guess that's one way to measure that dynamic. But I don't think there's any one metric for winning in this case. I think if we're really trying to be as thoughtful about it as possible, it's when we have a customer kind of experience that is I guess optimal, and customers are happy. That's the win of it all. But there's a lot of other components to that. So it's a very kind of philosophical discussion, I think, beyond an actual measurement or a criteria or a specific benchmark.
What about the overall ecosystem? Who are the key partners you see? How would you categorize and what role do they play in winning as a carrier?
I guess from my point of view, I think there's the ecosystem is very broad. We've touched on a number of different kind of traditional aspects of that: cloud, hyperscalers, certainly telcos, but it's really much broader than that. I mean, from anything that's as a service kind of environment or an application-driven environment is part of that ecosystem as well. And I think that's driving usage both for business uses as well as consumer-based uses. And again, some of the things that Paul mentioned around mobility and just the sheer volume of devices and the data that exists around those devices, it drives a huge amount of need for managing that data and supporting that data. And that comes with a whole other set of people in the ecosystem. So it's a massively broad set of players. I don't think there's a way to list out all of those, but I think there are big players and the more dominant players that have the bigger impact. Sometimes not always good. Sometimes, sometimes some of the dominant players can drive things in a direction that's predominantly beneficial for them, not necessarily beneficial for the ecosystem. And I think that's something that, some of the industry things that the telecom industry does is helpful to try to contend with some of that. But that's not that's not an easy challenge in a lot of ways. So, but there's put a list together of any set of companies that are technology driven and they're part of that ecosystem.
Ricky, what are your key success factors?
Okay, so I think traditionally for telco, we're probably too focused on infrastructure, probably too focused on products and solutions. I think those are very important too, but when you think about long term, especially the environment we're in, we do business with existing customers. They keep coming back to buy more from us. So I believe customer experience is very important, and why this related to softwarisation? Because when we talk to our customer, they said to us they want digital experience, right? So they want a digital buying experience, they want a digital post experience. So those are really that we're looking at. How do we get there? How do we enable those experience for them in the long term, right? So this is one thing. Now, the other thing is how we win is we think that through that experience that we really differentiate from our competition.
Paul?
Yeah, and I think I'd define winning in three ways from my perspective. Michael's right, it's a really challenging thing to say, but for our staff, winning is being able to provide that continuity of employment and a career path that gives you a sense of fulfillment and contribution to society. So the work that you're doing is meaningful, and I'm sure as an industry you'll feel that we're achieving that. For our shareholders, it's that return on investment. We're winning by ensuring the capital that's been deployed into our respective organisations are continuing to deliver value. And many people would presume that the telco industry are just trying to sweat the asset. Keep that Cisco 2600 on the edge for as long as it can. But for me, I think it's about exposing the asset. What attributes of that device can I put into a portal so a customer can configure it and I'm out of the road? They get access to the asset and they do whatever they want with it, and I just make sure they do that safely and securely. So I think that's really key in terms of what we can deliver value for our shareholders is maximising the return of the investment that we've made in our networks by exposing it to the users so that they can get the value from it. And then as an industry, the way that we can win is by IPv6 and our PKI and continuing to deliver really high quality, reliable infrastructure for the planet because we understand that domain. Michael runs one of the best, most secure networks on the planet. And that's probably because he started softwarisation 20 years ago. And so he's been able to, in many ways lead the charge. And NTT's got a great network and a great reputation because of softwarisation. And as an industry, we collaborate to ensure the security and integrity of it.
And what do you say to people who are saying that there's a risk of becoming a dumb pipe or getting disconnected from the customer? How can you fight against something like that to remain that being meaningful from the...
Yeah, so I've had that debate several times with the people that have used kind of that reference. And to me, it's really about the aspiration within your organization. If all you're doing is writing some dumb pipe, that doesn't really set the bar very high in your organization. They want to do great things or want to achieve great innovation or do something that's helpful. To me, it just sets the bar way too low. It doesn't necessarily mean that the pipe or the tubes are smart, but it's how customers are using them. It's how they're being utilized. And it's that infrastructure. I mean, quite frankly, I would tell you that I was exceptionally proud of our industry and of our team in particular when COVID happened and the flow of traffic shut up. We've seen spikes in many different cases for short periods of time before across the internet as a whole and certainly across our network. But to see a sustained kind of utilization level hit peaks that had never been seen before for a sustained period of time for many, many months until they kind of started to ebb a little bit was a huge thing for our industry. I think it showed that education, and not just shopping and watching movies, but much more important things, communication for business, interaction between family members and friends, could all be done in a way that really had not been triggered in that way before. So to me, that was a great achievement for the industry to be able to do that. And you didn't really hear about massive outages. You didn't really hear about massive problems in that 3 or 4 month period of time when COVID really first exploded. And again, I think that's because we, a lot of great companies doing a lot of things together and working and collaborating to help, kind of solve for that problem that was unprecedented, right? To me, that's one of the cool things about the industry in that sense, and where softwarization has been an enabling component for that. Without it, again, we wouldn't have been able to have achieved those things as an industry. I think that's I could be critical of us as an industry, but I think that's actually a very good thing that was achieved and was done. So.
Ricky, you want to elaborate your views? You talked about solutions earlier, talked about customer centricity. How can we as carriers?
Well, I think, when we look at especially, the pandemic really accelerate the adoption of, different technology. But at the end of the day, it's all about application, right? So enterprise come to us because they need that performance to use the certain application, whether it's on the cloud or software as a service or on-prem. So it's really changed from a connectivity discussion to more a application performance discussion, right? And they want to have visibility. They want to know what's going on. It's sometimes a bit tricky because it's not really running on a private network anymore, right? So it's running on a hybrid networking or internet. So I think that software layer become a lot more important for the customer to understand what's going on and to understand not only the connectivity performance, but also the application performance.
Paul, you want to add on this, or you want to continue with the next question, which is then how should and how what is the overall role of collaboration between carriers when it comes to softwarization?
Yeah, so I've been working in standards organizations for about 30 years, and whether that be Linux standards base, IETF, MEF, and others. And I think that the collaborative component of this industry is probably the most significant because no single carrier can own connectivity to every last mile. So, at any point, somebody in this room may be trying to connect to some destination in a completely different environment, and we have to, as an industry, collaborate to be able to achieve that outcome. As an app vendor or as some other part in the stack, you don't have that demand set. You don't have that mandatory requirement to collaborate to be able to deliver value. As an app, you've got your user, but as network operators and collaborators, we have to have standards, whether that be simple as IPv6 or BGP or MEF Sonata API. So it's core to our value proposition that we collaborate or we will not be successful.
Yeah, I mean, Paul's great experience having done this for so long in those environments. And I think that's part of what I think makes certainly, not maybe telco in the broadest sense, but certainly from an internet point of view, the whole basis of the internet is the exchange of information between disparate networks, in essence, and it's publicly available. At one point, we had a customer who wanted to have us assign them IP space, but didn't want it to be publicly announced. And like, that doesn't really work that way. The whole point of this is that it's public, right? That everyone can send and receive, traffic from those IP addresses or to IP addresses. And so, that I think that collaboration and the ecosystem of that collaboration has evolved over time as well. It's not just network operators or telcos anymore. There's certainly other contributors, other parts of that ecosystem that are in those, ITF and those organizations now as well. It wasn't always that way, but certainly that's something that's changed. That ecosystem has evolved and grown, which is important.
Ricky, any closing comments on
maybe
this?
I think it's interesting when we look at partnership ecosystem used to be horizontal, right? We work with carrier to expand our footprint to complement each other, but I see more radical collaboration on ecosystem because especially with hyperscaler, with cloud provider, with edge provider, or with security player. So I think this is a pretty much a very different ballgame. But I think it's become very, very critical. How do we work together that really beyond the telco ecosystem? Because we need those capability integrate on our platform to offer the service to our customer.
I think we're on the button here. So thanks, a big thank you for the panelists, for the audience. Before we close, is there any final question from the audience? You still would want to have the panelists.
Sorry, I would like to ask some more technical questions. Because you said about software-defined networks, what's your take on recent developments of programmable data planes, new kind of programmable routers, switches, and the whole open source communities on open networking foundation? Because I think they are relevant in some sense, and but they were not mentioned, I think, in your, yeah.
I alluded it. eBPF, I think, is beginning to emerge as a way for us to get that network function call inside the Linux kernel. P4, I think, is something that is going to be important for the academic and research community to continue to focus on. The big monoliths of Open Daylight and others, I don't operate it. I don't know if you do, Michael. Yeah. There's definitely bodies of open source software that have come together to try to resolve those issues of orchestrating disparate heterogeneous networks. They're probably not going to be successful in the environments that we operate due to the scale, and they're more focused on the local area network inside data centers. So good for academic research, but the enterprise domain would be there, not the carrier domain. We're dealing with infrastructure that's been in production and must remain in production for decades. And so there's a significant heterogeneous environments that we're operating. They're very different to the enterprise challenge, the carrier challenge. So P4, however, I think is probably the next thing from my perspective in terms of programmability of the network, and that's giving you the right level of network intent abstraction, as opposed to ODL sort of type monoliths, which are really just trying to abstract the divergence of implementation across equipment vendors. P4, I think, is a really pragmatic approach to what's the intent and how can we push the intent into the chip.
Yeah, so just that, model-driven CLI, MD-CLI, I think is something that is an open source kind of environment. We are much more engaged in supporting kind of broader open developments that occur. Paul mentioned RPKI. It's something we've also been very supportive of and launched ourselves. So I think there's a ton of aspects to the question you're asking, but I think idea that anything that's, we just would always think it's never a good idea to be specific to a single vendor in those kind of cases, and having that open source or that kind of broader community development is something that we always feel like there's benefit in, and we try to support that, with our people from our teams contributing in those organizations, and being a part of those conversations and driving those standards in an open way as opposed to a closed way. We certainly agree that that's an important aspect of this kind of progression for the industry.
Perfect. Ricky, Paul, Michael, thank you. And please come talk to us after the panel. Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ricky, Paul, Michael, for coming together for the conversation. I think we got some good takeaways, and thank you for the interactivity, asking the questions. I hope you got the answer you were looking for. So thanks again to our panelists. Up next, we have a fireside chat looking at 5G progression. So stick around for 2 minutes. They're going to take to the stage very shortly. There's clearly appetite for it a little bit. So.
Try to pretend I know what I'm doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for hanging around. Looking forward to this next chat. We have Suresh